Changing Fate by Being Aggressively Kind by Sir Cantus. Chapter 3. My Son, My Son. One thing that Phil notices right off the bat after acquiring one Technoblade in his care is that he's very quiet. Observant, curious, and brave, no doubt, but he's silent, never saying a word and only making a few sounds here and there. A squeal whenever Phil doesn't let him hold his hair right away, a small whine when he's woken up from sleep. He can understand Phil just fine. He seems to know language as a whole. It's only that he doesn't say a word in response. Phil doesn't mind. The kid is good company anyway. On the first 3 days of having Techno, Phil puts away his worries for the next kid, for the ongoing search that will need to continue, and works on gaining trust. Because the last thing he wants is for Techno to be under his watch, but to not trust Phil. Techno has a liking to gold, it seems, for when Phil looks through the gold coins in his bag, wanting to count and see what he has for the next town they'll eventually travel to, Techno practically throws himself forward, reaching into Phil's bag and nabbing at whatever coins he can grab in his tiny hands. He grabs a few handfuls and tries to hold them all even as they spill and fall onto the forest floor, and Phil laughs when Techno looks up at him with pleading eyes as if he's asking for Phil to help and to make the coins stop falling. "I need those, Techno. I was counting them," Phil says gently, leaning forward and reaching for the few coins dropped in the dirt. Collecting them up in his palm, Techno makes an annoyed noise as he drops another coin. They're hiding out in the middle of a forest, a small campfire put to the side, a little bed of leaves on the ground. Phil doesn't mind sleeping on the forest floor. He's slept in worse places, and Techno seems to not have any problem with sleeping right on Phil. With Phil's wings covering him and shielding him from the cold at night, the first nights are everything to Phil. And the first time Phil tells Techno to sleep, Techno lays down beside Phil, shoving his face into Phil's shoulder and curling up into a ball, trying to be as small as possible. Phil can't help himself in scooping up the kid into his arms, tucking Techno's head under his chin and staring up at the stars, his heart squeezing as Techno falls to sleep, barely visible under the feathers, a hand holding onto Phil's hair even then. He's so small, and Phil swears over and over to any gods that are out there that he will give everything to make sure Techno will grow up safe. Phil sleeps lightly these days, half so he'll notice if Techno wakes up, half so he can run if they get found out by anyone else. He doesn't know if word has traveled yet of Phil taking the first kid, but he doesn't want to take chances. So he travels carefully, stays vigilant. But for this morning, it's quiet and calm, and Techno runs around the smoldering campfire when Phil tries reaching for his coins back, giving a weary smile at the piglin who only blinks back, arms full of gold. Techno has a liking to gold for sure, and that seems to translate to why he grabs Phil's hair so often. But it's also not the only reason, because Techno seems to also have a liking to anything soft. Phil can't imagine there's anything soft and comfortable in the nether, especially in that little hole Techno had been residing in, so it makes sense in the way that Techno grabs onto his hair, or is fascinated with Phil's wings, sticking his small hands into them when Phil's asleep, Phil having to wake up to someone attacking his feathers. Even right now, Techno is entirely content with Phil's robe around his shoulders, coins falling over in his hands as he sits on the floor. Phil had been able to scrub most of the dirt off of Techno in a nearby river, and while Techno's clothes looked ragged and worn, Phil told himself they would just have to work until he got new clothes from the next village. So he gave his outer layer of clothes to Techno, and while the fabric hardly fit and it dragged on the floor as Techno moved around, he refused to let go of it. And the piglin rubs his face against the sleeves every now and then when he thinks Phil isn't watching. Techno's hair is pulled back neatly in intricate braids, courtesy of Phil and his knowledge of doing hair. Techno had enjoyed it when Phil tended to his bright pink hair, now clear of dirt, after Phil had washed it out. Phil had combed out the slight tangles with his fingers and wove them into a braid, and when he was done, Techno had turned and given Phil a confused look, as if asking why he had stopped tending to his hair. When he realized it was up in a braid, he ran his small fingers over it in wonder, then knelt up to Phil and tugged at Phil's own golden hair. Small moments like that, little moments where Techno looks to him with thoughtful red eyes and reaches a hand out, it makes Phil's heart rest easy, stress falling away for just a few minutes longer. Because this isn't the end. Phil still has 2 more kids to save, but Techno is a good distraction for a day or two. Phil enjoys the responsibility given to him, enjoys the way that he wakes up to Techno poking at his wings, and falls to sleep with Techno holding onto his hair. Techno follows behind him wherever he goes, watches with curious eyes at the side of the river when Phil is busy catching fish with the simple dagger he keeps on him. At one point, he tries holding his hand out to Phil with pleading eyes, wanting to hold the weapon, use it the way Phil does. Phil doesn't hand it over and only insists that Techno puts his feet in the water first, and when Techno squeals at the chill of the river, Phil laughs. After that, Techno doesn't try asking for the dagger again and glares at the rushing water like it's cursed him. Techno doesn't like the cold, Phil finds, which makes sense. He runs warm and comes from the nether as a whole. The chill of the night and the freezing river is something Techno has never dealt with, and it's something he decides he doesn't like. When he gets too cold at night, he hits a small fist against Phil until he wakes up, so that Phil will wrap his wings tighter around him and keep the night chill out. He absolutely refuses to leave Phil's arms in the early morning when the chill still hasn't left the forest. The first time he saw the river was something Phil thought was hilarious, for Techno approached it like the water would reach out and bite him. He had actually panicked when Phil took off his shoes and walked into the moving water, Techno holding out his arms and making a distressed cry as Phil gave words of reassurance that he was fine. Techno wouldn't follow Phil into the water, but he was fine with Phil carrying him over the rushing currents, and he stared at the river below him, at the few fish that swam by, and would look to Phil with questioning eyes, as if asking why the river was so quick. Phil tended to fill the silence between them by rambling on and explaining all he could about the world around him. Techno never had to ask a single question, and Phil would answer them all. It just keeps on going, the water moves along the rocks, and it carries the fish through the forest all the way to a lake, maybe, or even an ocean. And oh, I bet you won't like the ocean that much, mate. It can be even colder than this sometimes. He had went on, carrying Techno over the river and pointing out the light blue of the currents. Techno had been able to stick a hand into the water after Phil explained what it was, but he did not like it at all, for it was freezing. He liked it even less when Phil had to scrub dirt off his face in the river, and he clinged to Phil for warmth as Phil continued to tell Techno of the ocean, of the water. Don't go staring at the sun too much, it's not good for your eyes. You can stare at the clouds though, look, see? They move through the sky. Look at how they're all so big, so vast, Phil told, Techno turning his head down as soon as Phil warned against the sun, but hesitantly looking up again when Phil pointed a finger up to the clouds, and Techno pointed up a hand as well. Staring at a bird flying high. That's a cricket, mate. Hear it? They're small little things. They can't do much, but they love talking late at night, Phil whispered as Techno laid in his arms under the stars, eyes wide and wary, as a cricket chirped near their campfire, Phil letting him know that the sound was just of a small creature and nothing harmful. And I know you're not listening to this one, but I swear it seems like something you'd love. They're all quite bright up there, and the moon as well, constantly lighting up the night sky over our heads, Phil murmured quietly as Techno listened while half asleep, the two of them staring up at the sky through the trees. A few days of living in the forest, Phil's gotten restless, and Techno has gotten tired of the food that Phil feeds him. Simple greens found by the riverbank, a few fish caught out of the water. So Phil stretches his arms up with a yawn and plans for the next village and puts Techno to sleep early while the sun is still up. Techno gives him a confused look when Phil lays down with him, and Phil explains that they need to travel, but it has to be at night when they can move under the dark and not be spotted. Techno seems to understand anyway and shoves his head into Phil's shirt, falling to sleep within minutes. Phil closes his eyes with him and wakes up to the light night sky, sunset just barely ending. The last bits of sun fading away, Phil takes back his robe from Techno, checks his bag, lets Techno run a hand through the coins, and makes sure he has his knife on him, and he picks up Techno in his arms, stretches out his wings. Remember the first day, Techno, where I had flown out of the portal? Phil asks, looking up at the dim sky, Techno shaking his head. Then he's off, and Phil leaves the ground with a grin, Techno holding onto his shirt with a death grip, leaning in as close as possible as Phil flies above the trees, above the forest. The land is beautiful, even in the dim moonlight, and Techno turns his head up and down, up to the clouds over their heads, down to the trees passing under them both. He looks to Phil with a toothy grin, copying Phil's own expression. There's a village not too far off, and it only takes a few minutes of flying before Phil sees the lights of the buildings, the stone paths of the streets. He lands nearby and holds Techno close, walking quickly and silently, making his way around the back of the buildings rather than out in the street. It's a small town, quiet with nightfall. Techno stays absolutely silent the entire time, and Phil knows it's because he's explained the danger of others finding him. He's explained as kindly as he could that other people can be dangerous and cruel, and that while there's kind people out there, Techno needs to be careful. Techno hadn't entirely understood that one, only stared at Phil's wings. Grabbed at the necklace around Phil's neck and stared on in silence, 1,000 thoughts running through his head. Phil spots a small clothes shop soon enough, looking empty of customers but still open, and he moves to it with light steps, making his way across the street. There's a bell that rings as he walks in, and a person at the counter. The shop is full of fabrics and clothes on display, tucked away beside the walls, and Techno looks to the person at the counter, to the fabrics laying around, then looks to Phil and demands to be let down by hitting a small fist against Phil's shoulder. Okay, mate. Go play, but don't mess up anything, Phil says softly, and Techno takes off running as soon as he's put down, going to run his hands over whatever he can reach. The person at the counter is a bright young woman, smiling warmly as she sees Techno run off into the small shop, and she turns to Phil with a friendly nod. Hello, welcome to Emmy's Fabrics. She chimes and looks to Techno again with a fond look as Phil puts his bag onto the counter in front of him. Your son is cute. We don't get much kids with the Travers these days, much less ones who are this excited over clothes, she says, as Techno messes with the curtains by a small window. He likes the texture of soft things, I think. Phil shrugs. And the woman's eyes glance to the wings on Phil's back, looking shocked for a moment before catching herself. Ah, well, that's something I'll keep in mind. I'm sure I'll have some shirts his size that are soft enough. She smiles, and Phil recognizes the small look of curiosity, of wanting to ask questions, because half monster people, that's always something others have questions over. Do you have any shoes as well? I believe I do. There's quite a few stored in the back. We don't usually put them on display. They tend to get stolen. She nods, Phil glancing to the few outfits up on display, to the window in the front that shows off the clothes to the street. The window is half covered by a curtain, and Phil wants to pull the curtain all the way as a small group of people come down the street, torches in hand and swords at their sides. Now who is that? Phil mumbles, and Imai hums, waving a hand. A hunting group, looking for the blood god, she explains, as if it's a normal occurrence. And it really must be, with so many in the lands looking for Techno. People like them come through the village every now and then. The kid still hasn't turned up, but they're still searching. Phil watches as Techno fiddles with the curtains, and he holds a hand out, whispering harshly, Techno, stay away from the windows. Techno freezes, and as does the woman at the counter, eyes going wide. Techno takes a slow step back from the end of the curtain, then moves forward again, moving the curtain all the way so the display window isn't showing through, the inside of the shop hidden from the people in the street. He looks to Phil to see if that was all right, and Phil nods, smiling. Techno goes to close the other curtains. I'm sorry, she clears her throat, smiling. What is your son's name, may I ask? Phil glances to Techno, who closes the curtain of the other small window, then goes off to play with some fabrics hanging off a nearby table. Techno, Phil answers, reaching down under his coat. Techno. She trails off. Her smile is strained. Lovely name. Do you mind if I grab something from storage? She goes to move her arms away from the counter, eyes looking at Techno. Techno, with his pink hair, pointed ears, small little tusks. Phil moves quickly and stabs his dagger into the counter, right where the woman's sleeve is, and he leans in close, talking quietly. Technoblade. His name is Technoblade, and I know very well who he is. And I know you know who he is. She looks at Phil with wide eyes, taking in a shaky breath, eyes flicking to Techno and back to Phil. There's a cursed child in my shop. You've brought a dangerous beast into my shop? He's really not that dangerous, mate, Phil says tiredly, looking to Techno, glad to see that the kid is busy playing with the ends of hanging shirts, not noticing Phil threatening the shop owner with a knife. Let me make this clear. I'm here to get some new clothes for my son, some new shoes, then we can go on our way. Your son? She whispers back, leaning in with a face of disbelief. That thing cannot be your son. Listen, there's those men outside. For the good of everyone, let's just... Phil narrows his eyes. You try calling for those hunters, you're going to lose a finger. She only gives an unimpressed look in response snarkily, and Phil likes her for the fact that she's definitely panicking, yet still says a response that makes Phil want to roll his eyes. Lose a finger or lose my life? Which one do you think I prefer? She whispers, Phil raising his eyebrows. Really? Look at him. He's tiny. He waves a hand to Techno, who's currently running his hands along the layers of a coat, marveling at the fluffy material at the ends of it. Do you honestly believe he's going to hurt you? She looks conflicted for a moment, then, the stories. Yes, the tales, the destiny, I know. Phil leans back, keeping a loose grip on the knife stuck into the counter and reaching into his bag, grabbing a single coin. Watch, he says to her, and turns his head to Techno. Techno, look, come here, Phil calls. And Techno looks at Phil and spots the coin in his hand, then runs over, nearly tripping over his feet. He runs into Phil's legs, then reaches a hand up to the coin Phil's holding. Hopping up once, twice, tugging at Phil's shirt, the woman leans over the counter to look at Techno and blinks in shock at the sight of Techno just wanting the coin, giving a frustrated face to Phil when Phil only keeps holding it up too high. A small squeak comes from the kid, and Phil hands the coin over, Techno grabbing it and running off, sliding under a table. A coin? Emmy says softly, and Phil hums. The blood god has been tamed with a single coin. He likes gold, Phil says, turning his head to the woman again as she stares at the table Techno's under. And soft things. She looks at him with an absolutely confused face, and Phil just smiles. So, do you think you could get some clothes and shoes for him so we can get on our way? Because it really isn't safe for us to be out right now with him, Phil asks. And for a moment she looks to the wings on Phil's back, lost in thought. Then she sighs, looking at her sleeve still stuck to the counter with a knife, and looking at Techno again. All right, but once you leave, I'll have to tell others of this. That's fine. I can keep him safe, Phil responds, and pulls the knife out of the counter. Chapter 4. What makes a monster? They move to the small room in the back, mostly full of boxes of storage, chests of supplies, and Phil keeps watch with Techno trying on different clothes, clean, new clothes. And while it's wonderful for Techno to finally have something that isn't just rags from the nether, it's still a bit of a pain because the first shirt they try doesn't quite fit, too long past the arms. But Techno refuses to take it off, getting attached to the first thing that's an upgrade from his old clothes. He nearly whines when Phil tugs the shirt off, and he sits on the floor with an angry look, upset that his soft fabric has been taken away. However, he does raise his head when Phil raises up another option. Phil has to coax him with the promise of a gold coin to be patient, and he tells Techno about clothes needing to actually fit, not just be soft. And while Phil gets narrowed eyes and a frown in response, Techno listens. He's still upset whenever Phil swaps out a new shirt, though, and so Phil tries to keep the option short. Amy eyes Techno the entire time they try outfits on, hesitant and wary, as if any second from now, Techno will snap and murder both her and Phil. She walks over with a pair of shoes, places them at Phil's side, then quickly walks off, eyes still wary, still staring. Techno doesn't seem to notice, too entranced with the next shirt Phil's tugged over his head. And he grips a gold coin in his tiny hand as he wraps his arms around himself, enjoying the change in fabric, looking up at Phil as if asking if this one suffices. It doesn't. It's too small, and Techno hits his head against Phil's arm when Phil goes to tug it off again. Phil only laughs. They settle on a pair of black shorts falling just over his knees, and nice long-sleeved white shirt, and Techno doesn't let Phil help button it up, whacking his hands away to try doing it himself. It takes a moment, but he gets it, and Phil gives an appropriate smile when Techno looks up at him for a reaction. Techno smiles back when he realizes he gets to keep this shirt. After that, they grab some soft white socks, which Techno absolutely adores, kicking Phil in the gut a few times to get Phil to notice, as if Phil wasn't the one to put them on for him. The shoes, though, those weren't so easy. Phil sat Techno down on a small wooden bench pushed against the wall, and he grabs a pair of boots that Emmy had brought along. Kneeling in front of the kid, he ignores the way Techno stares at the shoes with a face, and is relieved to find that they fit just fine, tugging them onto Techno's feet. Techno doesn't like it. No, Techno mate, shoes are important, Phil tries saying, holding Techno in his arms, Techno kicking his feet wildly to try and get the boots off, having quickly jumped off the bench to try throwing the boots off. He doesn't seem to mind Phil holding on to him, keeping him still. He just hates the boots. Emmy lingers in the doorway of the back room and watches with curious eyes as Techno gives something along the lines of a tantrum, except without the crying and screaming. He just won't stop kicking. What if the ground gets too cold to walk on? or too hot. You need shoes to actually help, Phil says, keeping an arm around Techno, reaching down to Techno's leg to tug at one of the boots, which looked dangerously close to being kicked off. No, Techno says, half muffled in Phil's shirt, and Phil goes still because that's the first word he's heard Techno even say ever since he's picked him up from the nether. In his shock, Techno kicks a boot off, sending it flying away, hitting the wall before it lands on the ground with a thump. No? Phil repeats, grinning down at Techno, who makes a frustrated noise, trying to kick off the other boot. No, Techno says again, and nearly kicks the other boot off, Phil pulling it off for him instead, putting it to the side. Then Techno calms down and seems content with leaning against Phil, still kicking his legs, but just absent-mindedly, rather than in a way of trying to get shoes off. He nods to himself, seeming content. No, Phil says fondly, tugging lightly at the small ponytail behind Techno's head, Techno whining. Why not? He waits for a response, Techno staring at him, before leaning forward and face-planting into Phil's shoulder, like that will make them move on. Techno blade. Phil snickers, gently pushing at Techno to sit back up. Why not? Do they not fit? Phil wonders if maybe Techno just isn't used to shoes after being barefoot for so long. It makes sense if he would hate them then. There's a slim chance Techno ever tried on shoes over in the nether. However, Phil can't just let Techno go without any, because if they're going to be moving, Techno needs to be walking. And while Techno hates the boots, Phil thinks that Techno would also hate having something poke him in the foot. Techno tries to hug Phil again, and Phil has to hold back a laugh at the look he gets in response at stopping him. Techno acting as if Phil's committed treason, done something unthinkable. Mate, you can't just frown your way out of shoes, Phil says. Techno frowning even more intensely. Do you just not like shoes? I don't want him. Techno shakes his head, sentence coming out quick and mumbled, and Phil raises his eyebrows, not being able to stop the grin on his face. You don't want boots? Or just shoes in general? Phil asks, patient, reaching over to grab the boot he's put aside. The other shoe is still across the room, from Techno kicking it off. Techno makes a face, eyeing the boot in Phil's hand. You need shoes, Techno. No. I can't just carry you everywhere? Techno really frowns at that, scrunching his nose. Phil laughs quietly, smiling wide, and Techno stares at his face with a thoughtful look, then goes still as a bell rings out. Phil stills as well, eyes going wide as there's footsteps in the front of the shop. The bell ringing again as the door opens. Emmy is still by the doorway, and she glances to Phil, who wraps his arms and wings around Techno, eyes wide, nearly pleading. She walks out to the counter, Phil holding his breath. Techno is absolutely silent under him. Hello! This is the clothes shop, right? Yes, Emmy pauses, Phil looking around for anywhere to just run, but there isn't a back door over here, and if he wanted to get away with Techno, he would have to go through whoever just walked in. It's a matter if the lady is going to scream for help or not, and Phil slowly and quietly gets to his feet, Techno holding onto his neck. Phil keeps a hand on the knife at his side, staring at the doorway. You're at the right place. However, I regret to inform you we are closed. Phil feels the tiniest amount of relief in his chest, but he doesn't relax, still waiting for the worst scenario. He doesn't want to hurt anyone in order to get out, but that doesn't mean he'll hesitate. The door was open, though? The traveler asks, voice trailing off. Was it? Emmy says, voice full of false cheer, polite and chipper. Oh, I must have forgot to lock it. But as you can see, I did close the curtains, and I was just in the back, checking storage. Phil allows himself a small smile, happy to know he's being covered, and he makes a mental note to leave a tip for her kindness. I'll be quick, the traveler offers, Emmy laughing. You can be here in the morning, bright and early, and I'll be sure to sell you some deals then. However, I will need to ask you to go now. I do need to head home. Worth a shot. Thanks anyway. And there's the sound of footsteps and the bell of the door. Phil waits and hears footsteps coming along again. Emmy appearing at the doorway, looking conflicted as she sees Phil. Standing in the middle of the small room, holding Techno in his arms, Techno barely visible under his feathers. He folds his wings back, rubbing a hand over Techno's back, giving a small smile. Thank you, Phil whispers. Emmy sighing. I don't know why I did that, she admits, leaning against the doorframe. I'm glad you did either way, Phil says, putting Techno down. They move on from the tense moment, Phil having to coax Techno to put on his boots, coming to an agreement that Techno will put on the shoes just before they leave. But for now, as he goes through a pile of warm coats, he can just stay in his socks and be left to choose on which one he wants. Phil stands to the side holding the small boots in his arms as Emmy stands beside him, staring at Techno, who's running his hands along the different types of coats laid out, making a face at a particularly scratchy one. You know, one day he's going to be dangerous. He's going to grow up, Emmy says, hesitantly, trying to warn Phil of what's to come. She sees Techno now, fussing with the fabric, ragging his face against wool, and only sees potential for something that can become terrible. Phil sees differently. My heart won't be able to take that. I'll be thinking back on this wishing he was small again. Imagining Techno grown up, taller than Phil maybe. That kind of thought just makes him smile. Amy turns her head to Techno again, crossing her arms. Techno's struggling to put on a jacket, and once he finally has his arms through the sleeves, he keeps it on for a solid 3 seconds before deciding he doesn't like it, taking it off and throwing it to the ground. He's almost like a kid, Amy quietly murmurs. He is a kid, full through. Phil nods, giving a bright grin to Techno when Techno looks up to him, pointing at the jacket on the floor and then kicking it to the side. Phil gives a thumbs up in understanding. Techno moves on. He's a monster in the making. I don't know if you realize that, but you've signed yourself up for more than you can think of. Emmy turns her head to Phil, who only looks on at Techno. I signed myself up to take care of him, to protect him. Phil responds, voice calm. He's a threat to the world, Emmy whispers harshly, eyes glancing to Techno for a split second. Phil sighs, then turns his head to the woman, looking done. He's a kid who's been saddled with a bullshit prophecy and is being hunted down for simply existing. He's done nothing wrong. And if you're wrong, if one day he goes against you, snaps at you, what then? How are you going to defend him when he's killed and has blood on his hands? There's a reason his name is Blood God. And if you're wrong, if one day he goes against you, snaps at you, what then? How are you going to defend him when he's killed and has blood on his hands? There's a reason his name is Blood God. And how Phil wishes it wasn't. He makes a mental note to keep the other 2 kids from being named anything along those lines. Techno's already processed his name, responds to it. Phil won't put him through the confusion and work of forcing a new name onto him. But for the other kids, he wants to get there soon enough so they don't have to have such a name that promises destruction. I don't think you get it, mate, Phil says, watching as Techno pokes around at a certain blue coat, eyes curious. It doesn't matter what he does. Anything that happens either tomorrow or years from now, I'll still watch over him. I'm still going to love him. You're a little insane, Emmy says in response. Maybe, Phil admits, watching as Techno finds a coat that has fluffy wool on the inside of the hood, looking ecstatic. But I just know he doesn't deserve to be killed for simply existing. I'll raise him well, even if it means it'll end up in me being dead. Will you regret it then, after he's killed you? Emmy asks, almost bitterly. No, Phil smiles, Techno turning to him with a hood over his head, a new coat on. No, I won't regret it at all. They leave the shop soon after, new clothes, new boots, and Emmy giving them a half wave and some words before they go. I'll have to tell others of this in the morning. I didn't sell you out earlier because she says, standing by the door, the night sky full of stars over their heads. It's all right. I'll be long on my way by then. Phil nods, Techno in his arms, frowning at the fact he has shoes on. But he's happy with the coat he's picked out, and after Phil says his goodbyes, they're both off. Flying into the sky, Phil's set to go as far as possible from the village, from where he found Techno. He needs to wait for Techno's reputation to simmer down, for people to eventually give up on finding him months later. He knows that he's going to end up in tales. Stories pass from person to person. A winged traveler taking the kid meant to destroy them all, and taking it in as a son. Personally, he doesn't mind it, finds it a bit funny, if anything. So he flies off to another village far off, hoping to make it there and rest up, pass time traveling and exploring until the location of the next kid can be found out. The months pass rather quickly for Phil. They land in the village, find an inn to stay, Techno's face and hair hidden away under his hood, into Phil's shirt, and they spend the night in a proper bed, Techno stealing the pillow. They stay in the village for a little while, a few days, Phil talking with Techno, walking him through the town, letting him explore and see and learn. Phil's never been much of a teacher, and as much as he can try, he's not exactly the best at teaching Techno to read, write. But there's a library near the inn, and Techno runs his hands over the bookcases, flips through pages, not a clue on what they mean, what they say. Phil reads to him, reads story after story, night after night, and Techno listens on, never sleeping until Phil's finished the chapter. And even then, he still asks, quietly, sparefully, his words come more often, but he's still soft-spoken, for another one. One night, Phil complies, and he ends up reading all the way up to sunrise, passing out on the bed, waking up to Techno running his hands over the pages, trying to make sense of the letters for himself, since Phil won't do it for him. He goes to the librarian then, who's a kind, sweet old lady, observes Phil's wings with a sad type of fascination, holding onto his arm as if Phil's gone through too much. Phil's been through plenty, but he's not too upset over it. She agrees to help Techno learn, and Techno is wary, refuses to sit by her, only with Phil. And they work it out in the first few weeks, the woman having to sit across the table, Phil sitting beside Techno as they work through letters. Technoblade picks it up fast, and seems determined to copy the librarian's neat handwriting exactly. She's a fancy type of writer. Her letters curved and neat, pretty to look at, and Techno refuses to try writing any other way, trying again when he doesn't write an A the same way she does. Phil only smiles and watches in silence for those weeks as Techno listens quietly to the lady, practices back at the inn, on the floor with papers all around, pencil scribbling away, writing the letters over and over, neat, curved. They move to reading, sounding out letters, and Techno goes from stumbling over sentences to quickly moving on to actual books. It becomes so that he reads Phil to sleep instead, Phil listening to Techno speak quietly, stutter over a word here and there late at night. They stay in the town for over half a year, which turns into a whole year. Too quick, too fast for Phil, who watches Techno grow and learn and eventually come out of his shell. He's still shy, that just seems to be his personality, wary of anyone who isn't Phil, careful around people he does know, like the kind old librarian or the smiley baker who Phil always buys treats from. He's a quiet kid to most, but he loves to ramble to Phil late at night, asking and still grabbing at Phil's hair. He doesn't tug it, not anymore, but he sometimes attempts to braid it like how Phil does with Techno's hair, always tying it back in a neat pink braid. Phil's had plenty of experience with hairstyles, so Techno's hair is always nice looking. And Technoblade insists on learning, and Phil lets him, guides him through it. They stay for a while in that town, and it makes a mark in Phil's heart, memories all around. He doesn't want to stay in place, wants to keep moving, wants to be wary, but this town is far, rather isolated in the trees, and they don't have a priest or anyone with magic to tell of Technoblade's tale. The people know it, of course. They know of the blood god. It's been spread too far to not know it. But Techno is just the shy little kid who's always hugging Phil's legs whenever they linger in a shop. They're none the wiser. Techno needs somewhere to properly grow up, to learn, so Phil decides to live in the town for about 2 years. Techno growing up, learning. It's a temporary living space, and Phil knows it because they will need to move one day for the next kid. Technoblade knows that much, has heard it from Phil before, of how he's not the only kid Phil needs to take care of. But for those 2 years, Technoblade stays content, a kid, until the voices start. It's slow at first, Techno seeming distracted during lessons, trailing off during reading, staring off into space when they're walking around town. Then it's unsettled sleep, waking up to Techno gripping onto Phil with a tight hug, crying quietly. Technoblade gets jumpy, becomes hesitant, and Phil asks over and over for Techno to tell him what's wrong. And Technoblade just stays silent, even when Phil's on his knees, holding onto Techno's hands with worried eyes. It's a whole 2 weeks, growing progressively worse, and Techno clings onto Phil, eyes wide in fear, still staring into space, and Phil tries his best to help, tries his best to hug him at night, sing quietly, and try and lull the kid to sleep. He's not the best singer, but he knows small songs here and there. Techno enjoys them at least, and it helps just a little. Technoblade throws himself into reading, inhaling books at an unreasonable pace, and Phil can't seem to tear his eyes away from the words. and he decides to let Techno keep his nose stuck in a book, for it at least calms him down a little, makes him less unhappy. Then the hunters come, 2 weeks after the voices do, when Techno is just 8. Phil's in the bakery, talking with the people at the counter, debating to get maybe a small cake for Techno, who sits outside, a book in his hands. The bakery is a little loud with the sound of people shuffling, ovens burning, and so he doesn't notice right away. He notices too late. Technoblade reads outside, sitting on the ground, as 2 new people walk into town, notice him. They're friendly, kind, and one kneels down to Techno to strike up a conversation, grinning brightly. He pulls Techno's book down, smiling warmly, then sees Techno's blood-red eyes, wide and slightly unhappy that he's been interrupted in his reading. A knife gets pulled, a book gets dropped, and Technoblade hears one of them mutter "Blood God." His head is too loud, too quick, and he's being grabbed by the shirt, wanting to scream as his head explodes in chants. Too many voices to even process. And Phil turns as he hears screams and as heart drops, quickly making his way outside, pushing the door open, grabbing his knife as soon as he sees Techno's book discarded on the ground, and he pauses, stays, lingering in front of the bakery as screams sound out around them, the townspeople in shock. "Oh," Phil breaths out, putting his knife back quickly. "Oh, no." Techno stands over 2 bodies, a bloody knife in his hand, tears streaming down his cheeks, and he's shaking so bad, a hand held to his head as he realizes what he's just done. He turns to Phil and drops the knife, shaking his head. Phil, I didn't mean to. Techno stammers, Phil rushing over, kneeling down, wrapping Techno up in his arms. They wanted blood. They kept wanting blood. I just wanted it to be quiet, Dad. I didn't. Phil's heart hurts at the dad stuttered out, and he looks at the damage around. The travelers looking to be killed quickly, cut across the throat. They probably didn't expect Techno to be so fierce. That ended in their demise, starting a fight with something they didn't know of. "Who asked for blood?" Phil asks quietly, pulling back, keeping his hands on Techno's shoulders. The townspeople are circling around now, realizing, becoming a threat. But Phil needs to know. "I tried to stop. I tried to deny it." Techno sobs, Phil shushing him, holding a hand to his face. "Who?" he asks again. There's... Techno takes a shuddering breath in, hands in Phil's hair, smearing blood to them. "Voices. In my head. They just weren't being quiet, and I thought I had got it, but he had a knife, and it got so loud." "It's all right," Phil reassures, pulling Techno into his arms again, getting to his feet, picking Techno up off the ground. "It's all right now. Except it isn't, because there's 2 dead bodies on the ground, a bloody knife with them, and the people around them are starting to realize just who the blood god is. Phil," someone says, reaching a hand out. "Look, your son. He's not who you..." "Stay back," Phil warns, taking a step backwards, Technoblade crying quietly into his neck, holding onto his hair. "I know exactly who he is." "You knew this would happen?" someone screams, angry, fearful. "I thought that I could stop it," Phil thinks, but he doesn't say it out loud. He can't stop this. This is going to spread, going to cause more fear of Techno, is going to make life hell. He's going to work with it, Phil decides. Even with the added effort, if there are voices willing Techno to do this, then he's going to find a way to quell them. But the others won't care for that. No one cares for that. They only make steps towards Phil, carefully caring, as if Phil didn't know his son would turn out like this. Phil's known all along, and he's not any less loving of the kid in his arms, nor any less protective. "Listen, Phil," they say. Phil raising his wings out, glancing around. "Hand him over. I'm so sorry." "Stay back," Phil warns, and he pulls his knife, holding Techno close, holding the blade out in front of him. "Stay back right now. You'll end up like them if you touch him." There's glances to the dead bodies on the ground, and Phil for a second feels remorse for their deaths, then quickly moves on. They went after a child who was just reading peacefully on the ground. They pulled a knife on him. Phil doesn't care for that. He knows it's a bit fucked up, maybe. He doesn't care. "Be rational, Phil," the baker says behind him, and Phil turns around, nearly screams as someone grabs at his arm, grabs for Techno, and he swipes the knife down, cutting into someone's arm. Don't you dare fucking touch him. Phil steps back, the crowd following. Leave him alone. You'll be sorry otherwise. Then he raises his wings out and flies before anyone else can make another grab for him. He flies away from the disaster that was and holds onto Techno, gritting his teeth as the kid lays silent in his arms. They land. Hours later, Techno quiet, still, as they land in a field, no one around for miles. Techno's space is off, and Phil brushes his hair back, carefully puts him down onto the grass. His hands are still covered in blood. It hurts Phil to see it. How's your head, Techno? Phil asks, kneeling down, and Techno takes a moment to respond, looking up with a distracted air to him. It wasn't enough, Techno says quietly, looking near tears again. They still want blood. They don't care whose, Phil. Hush, Phil says gently, and reaches for his knife, pulling it out and trying to give it to Techno. Techno jolts back like Phil's burnt him. No! Techno screams, falling back, scooting back as Phil walks towards him. No, I'm not. You're not going to hurt me, Techno, Phil says, and he's fully sure of that. I'm not going to make you hurt me. Techno stills, Phil reaching a hand out, and Phil pulls him back onto his feet, still flinching when a knife gets put into his hands. Phil turns him around, points the knife up, as if Techno is about to fight against the wind, and holds his arms around Techno, hands around his, as Techno nervously glances back at him. You have voices, right? In your head? Phil says quietly, by Techno's shoulder. Technoblade nods. They're loud, Technoblade admits, and he sounds so miserable it makes Phil wish he could have helped sooner. Then quiet them. They want blood, Techno says distastefully, grimacing. Do you want to give them that? Techno answers, lighting quick. No. Phil raises the knife in Techno's hand, points it up at an invisible enemy. It's your head, your mind, Phil says, calm. So, quiet them. And he lets go, Techno taking a deep breath in. Then Techno lunges, swings, swipes like he's about to be killed, fighting against nothing, just the wind and air, and he fights in a way Phil didn't think he'd be able to, with his size. It goes on for a while, Techno screaming, sometimes nearly crying. Then he stops, stills, breathing heavily, staring off into the grass, and he runs to Phil, wrapping his arms around his neck, crying. Phil finds that the voices become quieter than they have been for the past 2 weeks.